I'm Rob Dietz.
I'm Jason Bradford.
And I'm Cher Miller. Welcome to Crazy Town, where the school board just banned every book save one, The Flat Earther's Guide to the Cosmos.
Hi, this is Crazy Town producer Melody Allison. Thanks for listening. Here in Season 6, we're exploring escape routes, pathways that just might get us out of Crazy Town. In today's episode, Jason, Rob, and Cher are escaping extremism. And here's a quick warning. Sometimes this podcast uses swear words.
Language!
If you like what you're hearing, please let some friends know about Crazy Town. Now, on to the show.
Jason and Rob, it's lovely to see you today.
Great to be here in Crazy Town.
Beautiful spring day.
Oh, it's stunning out there.
I brought my dog Willow.
Willow's so cute.
Our listeners, if they tune in carefully, might hear in the background.
Little pitter patter.
A little pitter patter, a little maybe his collar dangling.
Kind of pretty attached to Daddy.
I needed to bring him in today because the topic of this week's episode is pretty heavy.
Oh, you need an emotional support animal.
I did.
God, you're pretty attached to Willow.
I am pretty attached to Will. He's pretty attached to me. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so let's just dive in, okay? And I'm going to start with a question for the both of you, which is, what is the first thing that comes to mind when you guys think about extremism?
Oh, Scoville units.
What?
You know those hot pepper contests?
Got it.
Unbelievable. People eat this stuff, and I just McMillian Scoville units or whatever. Yeah. I don't even know.
How did you come up with that?
I like to get the ghost pepper juice into an eyedropper.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think of, we have a shop here in town, Yogurt Extreme.
That's what comes to
mind. Yeah, they have extreme yogurt.
You can pile the goodies on top.
Well, it's like every time we go there, it's always a big joke. You want to get some ice cream? Like, extreme yogurt.
What is it with gummy bears on top of that stuff? I don't understand how you mix gummy bears with
that's a kid thing.
You definitely sound like an old crotchety man.
Well, no, he
like
wants
Andy Rooney over here.
But they're like gummy worms.
What I really hate.
You know what I hate? Those red gummy worms on yogurt, frozen yogurt.
Well, you guys are being surprisingly benign with your
you told us you were sensitive.
Thank
so
you.
I was trying to
that's nice of you.
I have listened to the Long Shadow podcast and a lot of Leah Satili's stuff on the rise of the far right and the Patriot movement. So I could go there, but I'd rather talk about frozen yogurt.
Sorry. That's not what we're here to do. Of course, my mind went immediately to darker places when thinking about that. But I don't want to fall into the trap of just focusing on right-wing extremism, which I think a lot of people kind of gravitate towards, when they think about extremism, especially political extremism. Obviously, it's something I'm concerned about. It's something that's on the rise. But I think it's important to recognize that falling into kind of the vortex of extremism, it's something that everyone is susceptible to. It doesn't matter what your political, your ethnic, your ideological kind of fault lines are. And that reminded me actually of a really fascinating piece that was written by a writer for the New York Times, Kevin Roose, back in January of 2021. And it was about a woman named Valerie Gilbert. Okay.
All right.
Now, let me tell you a little bit about Valerie, as much as I know about her. About 8 or 10 years ago, let's say, she was probably somebody we might have come across in common circles, right? At least we could relate to her in a lot of ways. She's highly educated. She attended Harvard, so better than you, Rob.
Wow.
Does she say stupid things into a microphone a lot?
Well, she did say quite a lot of stupid things. We'll get to that in a second.
Right.
I don't know if she ever did it into a microphone. When she was at Harvard, she actually worked with Conan O'Brien at the Harvard Lampoon. She was like a self-described mystic. She cared about environmental issues.
What is that, a self-described mystic?
I don't know. I'd love to be one.
Yeah.
Especially if it's lucrative.
That'll be next season.
She wrote some books and stuff on it. Here's how Roos described her, okay? Quote, as an adult, she joined the anti-establishment left, advocating animal rights and supporting the Standing Rock oil pipeline protests. She admired the hacktivist group Anonymous. She looked up to whistleblowers like Julian Assange and Edward Snowden. She was a registered Democrat for most of her life, but she voted for Jill Stein, the Green Party candidate, in 2016, after deciding that both major parties were corrupt, right? Mm-hmm. So, you might not 100% align with those views, but you could definitely,
I've known people like that for sure.
For sure, right?
Yeah.
Well, then she came across something online and went down into the QAnon rabbit hole. Okay. Ugh. So she came across the Pizzagate conspiracy theory. I'm not going to get into Pizzagate. Maybe some of our listeners have already heard Pizzagate. But it basically was one of the sparks of the QAnon kind of weird online cult thing that was going on.
It's so weird.
Yeah. And I think a lot of what popularized QAnon was sort of a combination of the sense of community that people felt, because it was like, I'm privy to this conspiracy theory that nobody's paying attention to. I found the truth, and I've connected with other people, and they would signal each other. In fact, there's some elected politicians that would do a nudge, wink, wink to people referencing Q. I also saw somebody describe it as like having the appeal of a massive multiplayer game, because Q would like drop these cryptic messages and people would sit there try to decipher it together. It was like building a puzzle collectively online to try to understand what was going on. And for whatever reason, this really drew her in to the point where she kind of became obsessed with Q stuff, posting about it all the time. She called herself a digital soldier for QAnon, to the point that by the time Roos met her, she, quote, explained that Hollywood elites conducted Illuminati blood rituals behind closed doors, of course. Yeah. That former Representative Anthony Weiner's laptop contained a video of Hillary Clinton committing murder, as makes sense, as you would.
Right.
And that photos from a recent meeting between Mr. Trump and Queen Elizabeth II proved that he had secretly dethroned her. That was my favorite part.
I'm kind of flabbergasted. Like, I know you said something earlier about how we're all susceptible, and I'm sure I'm susceptible to being in some extremist group, but I can't imagine falling for any of this crap. That just seems like, I don't know, how do you make that turn?
And this is he's listing like 3 basic or 4 basic things of the QAnon, but there's 100 crazy stuff. Like there's like pages it could go on of each one of them nutty like this.
Yeah.
And that's what's astonishing.
Like JFK Jr.'s son still being alive and running with Trump and, harvesting adrenochrome from scared children.
Well, I think Barron Trump is actually the love child between Trump and Princess Diana, by the way, who is still alive.
Okay.
All right. Anyways.
So it goes on and on.
It's easy to mock this stuff.
Yeah.
It's also kind of freaky and puzzling, as I think what you were saying, Rob. But there's a real consequence to some of this stuff, not just the extremism that might direct people to do in real life, but also, Valerie wound up losing most of her friends. She became estranged from her family. It's like really sad, really and sad. I'm not sure where she is in her life now. I did try to look her up. I think she's probably gone offline, understandably, because, this was a big profile in the New York Times. She probably got attention elsewhere. I hope that she dug herself out of that rabbit hole and came out into the sunlight, but I just don't know.
Well, the whole concept of extremism could be a pretty big umbrella. How do you define what's extreme and what isn't when you're not talking about the yogurt world, of course. So I thought it would be helpful for us as we get into this to get a definition from a good source, okay? So the Anti-Defamation League has a pretty good nuanced definition, and I'm just going to go through it real quick for you guys. Extremism is a concept used to describe religious, social, or political belief systems that exist substantially outside of belief systems that are more broadly accepted in society. So it's, I guess the easy one-word opposite is extremism is outside of the mainstream.
Okay.
Extreme ideologies often seek radical changes in the nature of government, religion, or society. Can also be used to refer to the radical wings of broader movements, such as the anti-abortion movement or the environmental movement. So, you can think of environmentalists who are out there doing peaceful protests, or, I guess we would call ourselves environmentalists. But then there are ones who are out blowing up buildings.
Not Ray Kurzweil, sorry. That was an interesting Freudian slip.
Ted Kaczynski.
Right.
Yeah. And then, not every extremist movement is necessarily bad, right? The abolitionist movement is one example of an extreme movement at the time that had admirable goals that we would say should be mainstream. But most of the extremist movements are are kind of outside of the mainstream because their views are objectionable. We don't want them.
Or their tactics get violent, let's say.
Yeah.
This is the risk then, because you brought up abolition. And so this is a major challenge. What society decides to call an extremist movement is susceptible to the subjectivity of whatever is dominant power structures at the time, and can be used as a tool then to silence or sideline through propaganda, right? So you can imagine like the Red Scare, right? Way to flush people out in the McCarthy era, for example. So there is a serious risk by labeling people as extremists that you create censorship, there's a loss of freedom of expression that occurs because of these labels that really follow people around.
Well, in this time too, it seems like an extremist point of view can become mainstream, like QAnon, or you've got people in Congress that are that are buying in.
It's scary.
So it's almost that definition's it can be pretty squirmy, pretty wiggly.
Yeah, there's that, and there's also just who gets to decide, right? And as you were saying, Jason, labeling opposition as extremist has been a ploy of authoritarian governments, and it's definitely a fraught landscape to try to navigate. Along those lines, I think it's just worth differentiating for a second extremism and polarization.
Okay.
Because I think sometimes people wonder, like, if you have a polarizing view or polarizing perspective, you're like, where does it get into extremism? Some people call it toxic polarization, right? So toxic polarization can lead to a form of extremism in terms of like political views, for example.
Yeah, and then there's almost the flip side of what I was saying before, and it's that sometimes what mainstream society would say is extreme might actually be the right course, right? It's the factually or morally correct way to proceed. I mean, we already said abolition, but you can think of a real specific case like Galileo, right?
Right.
Or Copernicus. Here are astronomers who understand from observation and evidence the way the universe is laid out, and they get thrown in jail or locked up.
Well, think about what happened to the authors of Limits to Growth, how much they were gone after by mainstream economists, right?
Who we would call extremists.
Well, who we call extremists, right? So all our friends who are ecological economists are probably considered the weirdos, maybe the extremist economists. And think about Crazy Town as a podcast. Right? How much of what we say would be so far outside of the mainstream?
Yeah, I mean, folks in our camp are often just labeled Luddites or neo-Malthusians or whatever as a way of dismissing our views as being extreme, right? Which they are, of course. Let's just be honest.
Well, researchers have actually identified that there's different drivers that lead to extremism. Sometimes this can be things that relate to mental health, so that can be an important one, right? People who are having mental health crises may be more likely, with neurological conditions or trauma to be susceptible. Okay. But there are also a lot of social factors, including group dynamics that get involved. We'll go into more detail, or just when there are stressors in your environment, there's a lot of uncertainty. You're more susceptible to grappling onto extreme views, probably to create a sense of like closure and certainty.
Yeah, there's a couple of really interesting other drivers that I found when we were coming up with the ideas for this episode. And over on resilience.org, we had published an article called Widening the We by Colin Greer and Eric Larson. And they had two important drivers of getting to an extremist mindset or a toxically polarized mindset. And one of those drivers, this one really struck me. It's called malignant bonding. And what it is talking about is we all have this need to belong to stuff, to be in groups, to bond with others. It's a kind of an innate human trait, right? But sometimes we will fulfill that need by getting into groups that we really shouldn't be, right? That are malignant. So hence the term malignant bonding. Another driver that they pointed out is the scarcity mind. And you could say that this is a product of evolutionary biology. We're all out searching for resources that may be scarce. But then capitalism, which we have an episode, please go check that out. But it puts this into hyperdrive, right? This idea that you got to go out there and compete and get what's yours. And it's that competition mindset, then it's easy to get into an escalation where your behavior becomes more and more extreme. And then, in the capitalism one, we talked about how psychopaths probably make the best capitalists.
Yeah.
There's a dynamic. I've been thinking about this quite a bit, and I wish there was a term or something like Godwin's law, that was created to sort of capture the dynamic, basically, of people shitting on each other online, on the internet.
Right. That's like, what is that? Godwin's law? Someone's eventually going to compare you to Hitler or something like that.
Yeah. So I wish there was a law like that could be coined to describe the dynamic of how virtue signaling leads to more and more extremism, often within groups. So, you were just talking about malignant bonding, but within a group, if you're feeling uncertainty or stress, or you feel like you need to prove that you belong to the group, there could be a tendency of people to signal by going to more extreme ends to really show their adherence and their loyalty to the group, right? And then that kind of shifts, basically, in some ways, the Overton window of the group itself to that extreme. So that becomes the new center, of the group. And hopefully it's not like the second law of thermodynamics, which is, inevitable, like entropy, but it feels in some ways inevitable, like that these views become more and more extreme over time.
And then I think we need to talk about the role of modern technology, particularly social media and the influence of algorithms for spinning people off into more extreme views. Mm-hmm. There was a sociologist and columnist, Zeynep Tufekci. I think that's two words, Zeynep, and then Tufekci is the last name.
Yeah, she's an awesome writer.
She's a well-known columnist.
Yes. Yeah. Wrote a piece in the New York Times in 2018 called YouTube, the Great Radicalizer, that did a great job of personalizing how this algorithm fed more extreme or radical content. And this is a great quote. I'm going to go through this. YouTube was recommending content that was more extreme than the mainstream political fare I had started with. Intrigued, I experimented with non-political topics. The same basic pattern emerged. Videos about vegetarianism led to videos about veganism. Videos about jogging led to videos about running ultra marathons. It seems as if you are never hardcore enough for YouTube's recommendation algorithm. It promotes, recommends, and disseminates videos in a manner that appears to constantly up the stakes. Given its billions or so users, YouTube may be one of the most powerful radicalizing instruments of the 21st century.
So I find that fascinating. The whole vegetarianism to veganism, jogging to ultra marathoning. I get the same thing on YouTube. I wanted to see, how do people fish off the jetty at the Oregon coast? Because we go down to Newport every once in a while.
I can't wait to see where this takes
Well, it's like, you catch these lingcod or surf perch or these little fish.
Nice.
And then, the next video I'm getting is, see how I caught a 600-pound sturgeon in the Columbia River, the biggest freshwater fish ever. It's just like these more and more extreme fishing. It's like, it knows that sensationalism catches eyeballs. Yeah. And then, next thing you know, I'm not happy catching a surf perch, right? I have to catch something that
you have to get a megalodon.
Yeah, I got to get something that can eat me.
I will say YouTube has changed some of its policies and the way that its algorithm functions since those days. It came under a lot of criticism for pieces like what Zeynep had written and in other evidence of people basically going down these crazy rabbit holes, on YouTube. Perhaps less familiar is what has been happening at Facebook around the same time, specifically with Facebook groups, right? So Facebook launched groups back in 2010, but it wasn't until early 2017 that they decided to prioritize them. And they basically aggressively sought to make recommendations to users of groups that they could join, right? And at that time, it was February of 2017, Zuckerberg wrote, and I love this about Zuckerberg because he will try to present everything as being like, this is all about connecting people. It's like the highest possible, values that, so
look at all the extremists we connected.
It's incredible. So he wrote, more than 1 billion people are active members of Facebook groups, but most don't seek out groups on their own. Friends send invites or Facebook suggests them. If we can improve our suggestions and help connect 1 billion people with meaningful communities, that can strengthen our social fabric. Yeah, so people did get connected to a lot of fantastic groups. They also got connected to a lot of insane extremist groups, particularly right-wing militia groups and other kinds of... we won't get into the details of a lot of the horrible groups that people were recommended or incidents that were directly sparked or organized on Facebook.
Well, it happened to me because after I was watching those YouTube videos, I went to join a Oregon Coast Fisher people's group, and next thing you know, it's like neo-Nazi stuff.
It's incredible.
It's just it's right
there is a big overlap, right? In
Total,
the Venn diagram of those two.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh,
Sorry, fishermen. It's not fair.
This is not fair at all. What are you guys doing?
Basically, like their algorithm, there's a lot of evidence to show that Facebook's algorithm kind of saw things like, I support non-GMO stuff, as being in common with things like, I'm anti-vax.
Right.
Because they're both fringe, according to the algorithm. So like, since you like anti-GMO stuff, you must love anti-vax stuff.
Well,
right?
I bet you that's kind of how Valerie, your original story happened. It was like little baby steps.
Yeah, Venn diagrams overlapping. And
then suddenly you're believing in whatever happened in the pizza parlor and on Anthony Weiner's laptop.
Yes.
Which was filmed at the pizza parlor.
Yeah, of course.
So in 2020, Facebook executives, they knew a lot of what was going on. They were warned that 70%, this is an astonishing stat, 70% of the top 100 most active U.S. civic groups on Facebook are considered non-recommendable for issues such as hate, misinformation, bullying, and harassment.
Wow.
So they couldn't even basically recommend 70% of the top 100 because they basically broke those guidelines.
How come Zuckerberg didn't wax poetically about this? Nothing brings our members together like hate.
Misinformation.
It's a beautiful tool.
Join your local birding photographers group, people. I tell you, it's so sweet. You get pictures every day of the greatest birds in your area from top amateur photographers.
Yeah, I wonder what recommendations
and everyone's
they
like,
recommend.
That's beautiful. That's lovely. Oh, how cute. That's all you get. It's wonderful.
Pretty soon, Jason's going to be out there in the streets doing something extreme with
killing cats, basically. It's going to lead you to anti-cat groups.
It'll probably recommend that birds aren't real group.
Right. Yeah.
Now, it's important to recognize it's not just a matter of the influence of the technology or the capability of the technology, the fact that they can create these algorithms.
Yeah.
It's the incentive structure of capitalism, right? The goals that these companies have. So in YouTube's case, keeping people watching as many videos as possible. Facebook, having people on their site as much as possible so they could basically run ads at them. Now, Facebook's own researchers in 2016, this is before they made their big push to get people to join groups, found that 64% of all extremist group joins on their site were due to their recommendation tools.
Oh my God.
So they knew before they did this, and they're like, sounds great, let's do it. Right?
Hey,
they
it's
did it anyway.
More money, right?
Exactly.
Well, so we've been talking about what drives people towards extremism, and it's probably not that big a stretch for folks to think like, okay, social media plays a big role in this, especially with the evil corporate overlords that run those media empires, or maybe things like malignant bonding, or if you have mental health issues. But one of the really surprising things that drives somebody to take extremist views is about making decisions in a rational way. So let me explain. So, and this is a thesis by a researcher named Kavam. We'll put that in the notes. But the idea here is that when there is uncertainty, it's very hard to make a choice. What's the better choice if I don't have sort of these black and white or binary inputs? But if I have kind of an extremist view versus another extremist view, it's easy for me to say which one I prefer. And so I just go that way. And it's our desire to not be stuck in uncertainty, our desire to be able to make a decision easily and painlessly.
And
to
maybe
do it
even quickly.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Just like in some ways you could say it's rational, right?
Yeah, that's what they call rational decision making. Okay, so let's summarize. The key takeaway here is we have multiple drivers coming together, uncertainty and stressors in the environment, the existential drive for bonding and belonging, maybe personal trauma, perceived or real scarcity, and the rational desire also to simplify decision-making, all being supercharged by the internet and modern technology. And so it becomes very difficult for people to counteract these forces.
Oh, that's bad. It's bad for all of us.
Well, so let's talk a little bit. You hold my beer. You're saying it's bad. Let's talk a little bit about what extremism looks like in the wild, right, or out in the world.
I'm going to look at your dog for a minute just to calm down. Willow's so cute.
His ears is
let's just talk about extreme yogurt, can't we? Come on.
Or extreme haircuts on dogs.
Willow's extremely cute.
That's true. So let's just talk about the rise of hate crimes and extremist violence for just a minute.
Right. Okay? Yeah, let's go there. Let's do your thing.
So according to the FBI, hate crimes more than doubled between 2014 and 2022.
God.
I'm not going to draw a direct causal relationship between the rise of mobile devices and social media, but there's a definite overlap there. According to a 2023 U.S. Government Accountability Office report, incidents of domestic terrorism increased by 357% between 2013 and 2021.
Do you think when Apple was coming up with the iPhone, Steve Jobs was like thinking of these kind of statistics as
they almost call it the
possible?
I hate, but they didn't.
Right.
Yeah. So between 2010 and 2021, 35% of domestic terrorism was racially or ethnically motivated, 32% anti-government, anti-authority, 6% animal rights or environmentalism, and 4% abortion.
Go environmentalism.
Yeah.
Although I got to say, there's been a lot of reporting on the fact that the security apparatus, Homeland Security, had focused for a long time on environmentalists in particular as a major threat.
Yes.
Wasn't actually a very
and that's something you hear.
portion.
It's like it's tiny compared to this other stuff.
Yeah.
Now we're seeing a lot of tension and rise in hate crimes reported against Jews and Muslims since the start of the Israel-Gaza war. And the Anti-Defamation League recorded more than twice as many anti-Semitic incidents in the U.S. in 2023 than in 2022. So they were already on the rise before October 7th. Mm-hmm. And there were even more complaints of anti-Muslim incidents in 2023, surpassing the previous record in 2021.
Okay, so we've done a little tour of hate. I kind of want to back us out a little bit because those kind of stats are really alarming. And this, what you summarized, Jason, all the different drivers that lead to extremism. Something that strikes me is that extremism has caused less of a shit show out there than I would have expected, like sort of given all of this. And the reason I say that is I feel like I've been at times in places where extremist behavior has happened and it was really easy. So the thing that comes to mind, I lived in Washington, D.C. when there was a serial shooting spree going on. These two guys were driving around in a vehicle and they had cut holes in the trunk and they were sniper rifling people. And I don't actually know what their motivation was. It seemed pretty random, but it really shook people up, shut down the city. It changed. This was one of those things where the infrastructure of having shooters around changed the policies. Like they started changing when kids could be out on playgrounds and stuff like that. So basically like super low tech, two extremists changing the way a city was operating. I feel like if there were more extremist thinking, we would see more of this kind of crap going on.
Right.
Well, I think it's a good point. I do think it's a bit of a narrow scope, right? So in a sense, you're talking about violent extremism or extremism that's taken to the extent of
extremely extreme extremism.
I was going to say terrorism.
Okay, yeah.
Okay.
Right, extremism in thought leading to terrorism in action.
Yeah, so we're talking about hate crimes in this case. So you're talking about these guys in D.C. That's a form of terrorism. But you could look at it in a different way and say that look at political extremism, rhetoric that we're seeing. We've had lots of, sometimes they turn into violent, but extremely heated protests that have happened in different places. We had a riot on the Capitol.
Unbelievable.
I mean,
it has gotten to this point where it seriously has affected our ability to govern ourselves.
Yeah.
Yes. Even though there's not day to day.
So maybe not as much
whatever.
as much like direct violence, but it's there and it's clearly on the rise.
Yeah, I will side with you there. It's amped up, which is why it's worrying, right?
I think you're pointing out how easy it could be.
Yeah, to get worse fast, right? So,
now I've depressed myself.
All right. Well, let's change. Let's go back to some like more fun examples of extremism because
this is up my alley.
Yogurt? Are we talking about yogurt again?
Okay, I got one. sports extremism.
Oh,
Okay, my favorite are like the Red Bull sponsors all this extreme sport. You can see the videos of people like jumping off cliffs and doing flips.
I
and
love
then
me some Red Bull mountain biking down cliffs. Yeah.
Right, exactly.
Or those cities where they're going in those.
Yeah, like in South American, big up on hillside, they're going down alleys and stairwells.
Okay. How about this one? This one though. This was in it was like 2012, I think. The dude who took a balloon up to 127,825 feet and jumped out into space.
And he didn't even have to make like a penis-shaped rocket to do it, right?
No, he's the
went
balloon.
up in a balloon.
He went into a helium balloon.
Yeah.
He free-falled faster than the speed.
Free fell.
He free-fell.
Free-felled.
He free-felled faster than the speed of sound. He got up to 143 miles per hour.
To what?
843 miles per hour.
Wow.
Okay.
There was almost no air, so it became actually difficult to control his body, and so he ended up doing this flat spin where he was spinning like he's flying like 800 miles an hour and he's spinning. Oof. And so
it's an awesome merry-go-round.
The worry is that if you spin too fast, the blood starts gushing out your eye sockets.
Oh, lovely.
Because there's no air pressure.
Right. Jesus Christ.
Yeah. So, but
this is going to be lighthearted.
I know, right?
He pulled this special ripcord that had like it wasn't a parachute, but it slowed him down. It was like, and it's able to create some control. So gain more air resistance.
I just want to go back to
drag device.
I want to go back to your point, I share that Jason wanted to lighten things up with bleeding out of the eye sockets.
Well, it's sports. I mean,
this is what I was saying about virtue signaling before, right? So just everything is a little bit more and more extreme.
Yeah, I think just the Red Bull stuff is just nuts, right?
It is. I want to talk about a bit of mental extremism.
Okay.
So a few years back, you guys know the idea of Pi Day on March 14th.
March 14th.
So 3.14,
yes,
the number pi.
279.
Yeah, whatever. So you're doing it right now.
That's about as far I go. I don't even know if I'm right.
So this friend of mine's a science teacher, and they were celebrating Pi Day and making pies, and then there was a contest who could memorize pi to the most digits.
Okay.
And my wife prepared for this.
Okay.
She came in and did 100 digits of pi.
Are you
so it's
serious?
like,
No
3.14159. And I even asked her, how'd you do that? And she was like, she made up a story in her head where these numbers appeared in the story. And she could memorize the story, and then the numbers just fell in. Really
That's
cool.
incredible.
Wow.
But, sorry, honey.
Not very extreme.
The extremism here is the record is held by Suresh Kumar Sharma, who recited 70,030 digits in 17 hours and 14 minutes. So that's an average of 1 digit per second for 17 hours.
I don't understand.
Oh my God.
Wow. What else does he do with his life?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, the brain.
I can't stop here with mental extremism. I got to go back to your sports example, Jason.
Okay.
So, okay, guys, bear with me. There are a lot of people who are opposed to martial arts type sports like boxing and MMA, mixed martial arts. And I get that. They're very violent. It's hard to watch sometimes. Sure. But at least those guys that can duck and weave and block and move and
they can tap out.
Try to stop the other guy. So there's a new sport called slap fighting.
That's the stupidest thing.
It is the dumb. So these big guys stand at a table, and when it's your turn to slap, you just you rear back and you come as hard as you can and just slap the other guy across the face who has to stand motionless.
I mean, don't you want to go first? I mean, just knock them out and then you're done. I mean, it doesn't make it. You flip a coin. I go first. Okay, knock them out.
I mean, these guys are huge though. They're like their hands look like roast beef.
Prepare and they don't get knocked out
because you can't. You're not supposed to hit the temple. I think you have to
right on the cheek.
Yeah. So you don't get knocked out. You just break your jaw.
Imagine.
Great.
Imagine the stupidity and that is extreme. Like, what are we doing? What kind of society are we?
I'd ban that if I was a
Give me Suresh over those guys any day.
Yeah.
Right? And let me bring it back to where we started a little bit with the kind of QAnon, Trumpy stuff. Are you guys familiar with dear departed leader Donald von Schitzenpants?
Yes, I'm familiar.
You are? Okay.
Yeah.
So for our listeners who are not familiar, Michael Cohen, who used to be Trump's lawyer, there's a whole lawsuit that's related to Michael Cohen paying off somebody, blah, 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 blah. Any case, they hate each other. Michael Cohen's been going after Donald Trump, and he decided to call him Von Schitzenpants for some reason.
Like on TikTok.
Yeah. which I have to find very amusing. But the most amusing part is that
it gets better.
Trump's devoted, loyal followers decided they needed to show their dogged loyalty to him by now wearing adult diapers in public.
This is virtue signaling at its finest.
It's so beautiful.
You can get specifically branded Kaiser Donald von Schützenpants diapers to wear
we
to
should
protest.
start
business.
that business right here.
Let's go right now.
Now.
Okay, it's time to hang out with our dearly departed Marvin Harris and looking through the memorial lens of doom. Quick recall, Harris's theory of cultural materialism had infrastructure, which is the physical world around us, structure, which is the rules and the way that we organize society, politically. And then there's a superstructure, which is our belief system and our worldviews, and his particular emphasis on the role that infrastructure plays in kind of shaping those other two. Okay, so we're going to start with infrastructure. What is the infrastructure that supports extremism?
It's big ramps and balloons and other things that Red Bull
Really
has
huge.
for people to jump off of. And,
Evil Knievel's entire set.
Double shocking systems on the bikes. It's incredible.
Cannons that fire people. Yeah, that's it, right?
So I think quickly I would just say there's the communications infrastructure. We talked about that when we think about social media that's controlled by the corporate behemoths, how they do the algorithms and all that. There's actually the human brain, too. We've talked before a little bit about like human biology as an infrastructure. And I think it pertains in this case as well, because, we have certain cognitive biases. We have a desire for simplicity in our worldview. We like using heuristics to make complex decisions. Nuance and uncertainty involve high cognitive loads. There's also just like the stress, certain hormones released in certain situations, or the dopamine you get, from falling into conspiracy theories or whatever. There's the societal complexity, right? There's the fact that the world becomes more and more incomprehensible. Yeah. And how do we make sense of it? And so that also does lead us to seek to have simplified narratives, which often can be a form of extremism.
I also would want to call back to our episode on individualism, episode 89, because this built environment we have, car-centric, living with few people in a household, people have become more and more isolated and lonely. And this culture of individualism leads to a lack of belonging. So that is a risk factor, right? That we talked about. And it might be harder than to spend hours going down a YouTube rabbit hole if you're hanging out with friends.
Sure. Yeah. Or imagine the echo chamber inside your own skull when there's no other inputs.
Yeah.
That's not great. Okay. Well, that's the infrastructure. Let's look at the structure here. And what I want to focus on is really the media. So the media is beholden to rules of profit maximization and increasing market share. And as a result, they know what sells. And of course, it's more and more extreme content, more and more negativity, as opposed to getting people to engage with positive things or even just neutral things. Mm-hmm. No, it's the negative and the extreme. And there's something that happened that kind of ramped this all up. We've heaped a lot of criticism on Ronald Reagan and his administration in the 80s.
I think Jason, way back in episode 2, wanted to punch Ronnie in the face. Yeah. Remember that?
I mean, right. Great movies at the time, but pretty rough presidencies. But in 1987, there was the removal of a particular law. It was called the Fairness Doctrine. And it was initiated in 1949. And what it said was that radio and TV had to give time to opposing viewpoints. So you couldn't have like a Fox News that just monopolized one particular angle of a debate. Mm-hmm. And by removing that in 87, it gave rise to all these hosts and outlets like the Rush Limbaugh types who just catered to, like, say, the angry white male and helped to extremify.
So they would have been basically banned from the air eventually. Someone would have sued or whatever.
Yeah, or you would have at least had to have the other side represented. Yeah. So it's not just piling on. Yeah.
I also think that there's a structure that happens. It's not a formal structure, but it becomes a sort of, groups have bonding rights or rituals, hazing in frats and sports teams, gang tattoos, cults that require giving away all your possessions and avoiding ties to people outside of the cult. This creates that level of commitment that it's hard to rival. So these minority groups then end up wielding outsized power because the effort that per individual that they put it is very high relative to mainstream folks.
Yeah.
The other thing that's structural is we have laws in the U.S. about protecting free speech, constitutional protections for free speech. So the U.S. government has no legal right to curtail most forms of expression, no matter how vile. Some people argue this is a weakness. Some argue it's a strength. Mm-hmm. See, other places have structures like Germany that forbid certain types of speech. But no one's sure how good this is in the long term because the forbidden becomes a lure, right? The forbidden fruit. And these things go unchallenged in sort of open mainstream dialogue, the views that are kind of maybe abhorrent.
Well, it gets back to what we talked about very early on in this episode, which is like who gets his side and that whole censorship thing.
I do think we need to appoint one of us to give the anti-crazy town viewpoint in each of these episodes. I mean, our extremist view,
point.
We keep putting that out there. We need the fair and balanced other side.
Yeah, well, I think we should just ask Schellenberger, to join us, for every one of our episodes.
Oh my God!
Oh, how much fun would that be? Okay, well, let's turn to the cultures and beliefs of extremism, and I think maybe one of the most obvious ones to point out is religion and religious extremism. If you are relying on faith as opposed to evidence in order to know that your view is the right one, it was ordained by God or whatever, it becomes kind of easier to follow through towards extreme behavior from that. I mean, you see that all over the world. It's a thing that's happened all through history. Maybe going back to what I was saying about the media, and maybe this is also tied to what you were describing, Jason, with Zeynep Tufekci's piece about ramping up.
Yeah.
This has really happened in what I would say extremist broadcasters. It's like you had a Rush Limbaugh who just sounds like a sane, staid voice compared to an Alex Jones, right?
Man, that is a low bar you're setting.
Yeah.
I know, but that's what I mean. It's like you can't get as much attention until you start saying, I will eat my neighbors. What are we doing here?
Yeah.
And I think that...
Join my Facebook group on cannibalism.
Like that. Yeah. Join my group with Cookie Monster. Nom, nom. Yeah. There's that one-upmanship that I think it's a cultural thing. And then we have an episode coming up, actually our next one, on othering. And that's one of the keys to extremism. You can take this point of view. You're either with me or you're one of those others. You're an inhuman, evil pile of shit, right? And thinking that way really helps you to take extremist views and do extremist things against those others. So I'm looking forward to that episode.
Every decision I've ever made in my entire life has been wrong. My life is the complete opposite of everything I want it to be.
If every instinct you have is wrong, then the opposite would have to be right.
Okay, so thinking about doing the opposite around extremism, I think it's worth starting at the individual, thinking about ways that we as individuals can avoid or minimize the risk of falling into extremism or extreme views ourselves. We had talked in episode 78, which was the finale of our season on false prophets, about Megan Phelps Roper. Do you guys recall that?
Yeah. She's, I was really impressed with where she's come.
Yeah. So she was, listen to the whole episode, but she had escaped from her family's extremist hate group, which is the Westboro Baptist Church. And she shared a set of 6 questions that she came up with that she uses to challenge her own beliefs in situations because she knows what it's like, right? We'll share a link to that in our show notes. I think it's worth really checking those out. And I've actually been trying to practice them a little bit myself in situations.
Good. Well, part of avoiding extremist positions, both in ourselves and others, is seeing the other side. And to help with this, there's what are called Rappaport's rules that are meant to encourage productive, critical discourse and avoid straw man arguments. And I like the term, what is it called? Steel man arguments. So the idea being that you should attempt to re-express your target's position so clearly and vividly and fairly that your target says, thanks, I'd wish I thought of putting it that way. So that's steel manning. You should list any point of agreements, especially if they're not matters of general or widespread agreement, like, the sky's blue, whatever. You should mention, hey, Willow, you should mention anything. That's a good stretch. You should mention anything you have learned from your target. And only then are you permitted to say so much as a word of rebuttal or criticism.
Well, that's a toughie.
Yeah.
I almost wanted to have a rebuttal to what you just said right there.
But you couldn't.
No,
You're gonna
you
put the
are
work in.
a stupid idiot, but let me tell you what I've learned from you.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things that's, I think, important in avoiding extremism is, this is going to sound kind of simple, but it's taking care of yourself. In doing that, it also includes the ability to live with uncertainty and also embrace nuance. We talk about that a lot in this show. It's like nothing is so black and white. It's almost always balance, nuance. You got to kind of find your way. Another thing we talk about on this show a lot is windows. We've talked about the Overton window, what policies.
Where are you going with that?
Yeah.
Windows.
What are you talking about?
But I want
We
to
have
talk.
a Windows sponsor.
We had a show on the history one about plate glass.
Yeah, we did. I remember that.
Yeah.
See, I told you we like windows on the show. So the window.
That was the one on World's Fairs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the window I want to talk about, though, is the window of tolerance, which is the idea each of us has kind of a boundary that we exist in. And when our window is big, we can handle more of the crap that's going on around us. When our window gets tighter, it's tougher to deal with. And I want to mention that we're... Post-Carbon Institute is offering a deep dive on emotional resilience, and we're trying to pull together kind of a curated bunch of resources to help people build their own emotional resilience. And some of the basics that we're talking about here to help yourself along the way, obvious one, minimize how much you're doom scrolling and going down the rabbit holes that you brought up a share on social media or even mainstream news. My God, it gets so depressing. Pay attention to the Holy Trinity, meaning eating well, getting good sleep, and getting good exercise, especially out in nature if you can. And work on addressing your own fear of scarcity. Try to understand what things really are scarce, how much does it affect you, and try not to let it color your entire outlook on the world.
Okay, so once you've taken care of yourself here, let's talk about how you can care for others, right? Things that we could do when it comes to reducing the risk of extremism or helping people recover from it or standing up to it in our own communities. So, there are folks who have gone through the experience of having to help people in their lives who've fallen prey to, well, I would focus on nonviolent extremist views. I mean, when it resorts to violence, that's a whole other matter. But, there are many people. I mean, we've talked about QAnon. There are other examples that people have, I think, millions of people where loved ones have kind of gone off the deep end on some level. And so how do you do that? How do you deal with that? There's a woman named Diane Benscotter she was a former Moonie, so she was part of a cult. She's been helping people escape from cults since she left the Moonies back in the 1980s. She founded an organization called Antidote. It's antidote.ngo. It's a nonprofit that runs kind of like Alcoholics Anonymous recovery groups for people that are caught up in disinformation and for their families. And they see that the problem of psychological manipulation, and we didn't talk a lot about this, but there are groups out there who are very knowledgeable about how to draw people in to their extremist views, right?
Yeah.
They look for people who are susceptible, who are vulnerable, who are lonely.
College campuses are a place that happens too.
So there's a lot of psychological manipulation that happens, and they see it as a public health problem. And so they work on both the prevention side and on the recovery side. There's also a different approach called like thought reform consultation, which doesn't aim to do kind of non-consensual interventions. It's not about like, taking somebody off the street who, like, let's say disappeared into a cult or something and intervening in that kind of a way. It's usually like a lot more effort. It requires a lot more work on the part of the family or the loved ones rather than having like a quote unquote professional intervene where you're like literally taking somebody and sticking them in some kind of care facility or something. So it's more work, but it's less aggressive and it is kind of the slow process of inviting people in by asking questions, providing them with more information, doing it in a more kind of ethical and patient way. And they found that it could lead to like longer term, better outcomes doing it that way.
Yeah.
One of the things that stood out to me in thinking about how would you do this at the community scale is it's kind of like a community standing up to bullies. So, we all can picture the high school bully and, like to take away their power, you have to stand up to them and show them that they don't have that power over you. And people who can do that against extremist groups in their communities, I would say get engaged and be willing to put yourself in these uncomfortable situations, especially if you have the privilege or enough a sense of power yourself to be able to do that.
So there's actions that you could take to stand up to organized efforts or groups that are outspoken, but it could also be much more subtle comments that are made by people that are in your life, that repeat something that you sense is a non-nuanced view. It's not an empathetic view. Right. It's a very black and white view on an issue.
Yeah.
And there are techniques, and I think we might get into some of this when we talk about othering, that are really around empathetic listening. So it's not just challenging them. In some cases, I think we have to stand up, like sometimes even physically put ourselves in harm's way to protect people, especially if we're in a position of privilege to be able to do that. In other cases, it may be just challenging people with some empathy, with some questions, maybe even following some of those rules that you had talked about.
Right.
Earlier,
Someone will
Jason.
sprout some kind of meme and you're just like, well, I understand why I hear that, but it worries me that it's so absolute, and maybe just be empathetic about, I see why you'd be upset.
Or even asking them a question of like, what do you think a person on the other side of this would say to that?
Right. That's good.
Yeah. I think there's also, if you're not in a position to do that, to stand up, maybe there are indirect ways that you can influence extremism to take it down a few notches in your community. And this comes from maybe the infrastructure argument that you were bringing up earlier, Jason. And that's a lot of extremism has flowed from people who are hurting. And there's a pretty well documented hollowing out of a lot of communities across the United States, right? Like we've discussed this in our episodes about like Main Street got lost, right? Yeah. And opportunities and small family farms were lost. And so people lose their livelihoods, they get angry, they are more susceptible to extremism. So you could address that infrastructure and that quality of life within our communities with some of the other things we've proposed over time, like rebuilding local economies, making sure everybody has access to good, healthy, nutritious food, and the people are sheltered, and helping out with mutual aid networks. All these kinds of things can, at least in an indirect way, influence how susceptible people are to extremism.
Yeah, we talked about mutual aid networks in the episode we just did on escaping individualism.
Yeah.
Right? So there's some resources there for folks who want to look more into that.
Yeah, I think that, we're thinking about the society here. There's a big challenge in responding to extremism or reducing the risk of extremism, because again, it raises issues of censorship. Who gets to determine what's extreme? There becomes the violence and control from the state. So there are hints of how to do this, though, and it may be more about the rules of social media. Like if you were to have laws that force social media companies to give users control over the algorithms, open up what these algorithms are, govern my own feed without falling into censorship.
That would be kind of cool if you just had a little
dial
choice, right? And you're like, I don't want any fish bigger than 400 pounds, okay? We're setting a limit here,
That's a
people.
very specific tweak of the algorithm.
Yeah, think how many little check boxes you would have to have across your social media feed to dial it in.
I want videos of big trucks, but not monster trucks.
Right, yeah, exactly. Right. No bigger than Ford 250.
Well, you'll be happy to hear, Jason. There is a very recent lawsuit that was filed by the Knight First Amendment Institute at Columbia University against Meta, the parent company of Facebook, arguing that the company is required by law to allow users to control their algorithms, which I think could be a really profound shift.
You have only 20 steps of clicking to get
You
to
got to
it.
get that thing in place before everyone's joined an extremist group, though, because then you just get more and more extreme.
Right. People are just like, they're moving the toggle all the way to one end or the
Like,
other.
let's say I got sucked in by the 600-pound fish group. Now I'm going to go 800-pound fish, 1,000-pound fish.
They're like, do not show me anything from NPR, that extremist media organization. Another thing I was thinking about is fostering diversity, right? So I do think that what we have a little bit with like politics here in the United States, for example, is we have this kind of binary choice situation oftentimes
Right.
between two dominant political parties. And then the dynamics within those parties, the way they work, especially when you've got a primary system where you're trying to appeal to people that are part of that party, it leads people to sometimes be more extreme in their positions. Again, it's partly the virtue signal that they're part of like this group of people. And so we can see people being elected with more extremist views, or what we're being presented are those two options.
Views, yeah.
And so there has been a push for things like ranked choice voting, which is actually about trying to create sort of more diversity within the ecosystem of voting, but it might actually lead to a diminishing maybe of extremism if you're able. So ranked choice voting basically means that, you know, you basically prioritize the options that are in front of you. You say, this candidate would be my first choice, but if they don't win the majority of the plurality or whatever that's needed, this is my second choice.
So if you're running, you're not just running to try to convince the most extreme members of your party. You're also realizing I have to have a crossover appeal so that I get the second choice. I'm the second choice candidate for a lot of people too.
Yeah.
So I can see how that works.
That's interesting from the candidate's point of view. Maybe it tamps down extremism, but I was just thinking about it from the voter's point of view. It would allow me to vote for the most extreme candidate as my first choice, sort of knowing, okay, the odds are whatever, Kermit the Frog is not going to get elected as president. So my second choice,
and Miss Piggy,
I can say has a better shot. And so I could actually, I don't know, would it maybe it tamps down extremism among the candidates, but not necessarily among us voters.
I don't know.
Good question.
It's a good question. I would love to see, I guess, because I feel like,
I
guess it could get worse than it is right now, but we've seen a trend towards further, they call it affective polarization, which basically means how much people who identify with one party hate people that are identified with the other party. And that has become, at least in the United States, and I think it's probably true in other countries as well, more and more extreme. Like there are more negative views over time. So let's have more candidates. Let's have more options for people. And maybe that would provide not only crossover appeal necessarily, but just more opportunity to understand different views.
Well, I like it when we're having these conversations and I get an epiphany, which is I'm totally voting for Kermit and the Green Party in the next election.
You
I
should.
mean,
Kermit is Kermit the Green Party candidate?
It's not easy being green, he says.
True.
And does anyone hate Kermit the Frog? Is there a Kermit haters group out there? I don't.
Whoever was with Miss Piggy before.
Right.
Probably
Yeah.
was. Yeah.
But I gotta wonder if this episode is worth anything at all because
Our listeners have been wondering the same thing.
look,
I should just quit right now.
but look, in some ways, I kind of think to myself, isn't extremism what we need right now? I mean, it's with me right now. You know, there's no politically acceptable, responsible. Nobody.
The non-extremist position so far, the status quo is not really.
It doesn't
done
do anything.
Yeah, it hasn't. It's sending us over.
It doesn't do anything for what?
Overshoot. I could barely get the word out of my mouth. Our overshoot situation is so bad, and there's no candidate, there's nobody on any party I can see that has anything to do with it. Doesn't touch it. So no one's even expressing anything about what I think is the most important issue happening right now. So are we doomed to face in a horrible collapse? We can't even talk about it. And if we believe this, what should we be doing with our lives, right?
We should be podcasting about it, obviously.
Well, I think this is a really important point. It, to me, raises just how difficult of a predicament that we're in right now, because if we're presented with two options, which is stay the course of basically mainstream thought, a mainstream approach to everything, because we don't want to fall into the extremist views or whatever, that's not helping us, right? But if we're like, this doesn't work, so our choices are basically, and actually, you kind of saw this. I saw this a lot in 2016 with people I knew who were debating whether they're going to vote for Bernie Sanders or Donald Trump.
Yeah.
Because in a sense for them, it was like any alternative but the status quo. And I get that motivation, because status quo is basically
a doom. Nothing.
But here we are talking about the risks of extremism, and if the alternative is extremism, how is that going to turn out for us?
Yeah,
right?
I don't know. That's why I'm wondering. Like, that makes me think about actually retreating in a sense and saying to myself, I should be investing all my time into something that comes after this. This is not going to last. So remember that movie Captain Fantastic?
Yeah, with Viggo Mortensen and his family, that they live out in the woods somewhere here in the Pacific Northwest.
Right, and their kids are incredible. The kids know how to like do everything that no kids know.
Yeah, he teaches them how to hunt deer with a spear and how to rock climb and how to forage.
We've talked about not dropping out, Jason, right?
Well, this is what's so shocking though, is every once in a while I'm like, but don't you want some people to drop out? So like, if it all goes to shit, there's like maybe some humans that know what the hell to do.
Basically, you just want to be Viggo Mortensen, is what you're saying.
Maybe I could give you a slight shift in thinking about this. Okay. So maybe our views and our beliefs can be considered by the mainstream right now extremist, right? Because we're challenging the status quo of thinking. Mm-hmm. But our approach to shifting the conversation, our approach to offering alternatives, doesn't have to be extreme in its orientation. So if we seek to have meaningful, nuanced conversations with people, if we're trying to engage people to live in that liminal space between, it keeps us maybe from taking these really rigid extremist views and entering into a space where we're like, this is what we're currently doing is not working, right? And we know that this is failing. So let's have a conversation. So maybe it's the approach is not extreme.
Yeah.
Even if some people that are part of the status quo are going to see that the beliefs are extreme.
Right. And so I think that's true. If someone is at least kind and nuanced and listens well, even if they have views that are radically different than mine, I'm much more likely to say, oh, wow, this person seems reasonable. So maybe I should pay some attention.
And also, if we could be open, maybe we'll learn of ideas or approaches or different ways of thinking about things that are actually helpful, right?
Yeah. It is tough, though, because you brought up earlier how ecological economists are the fringe extreme, right?
Yeah.
But when you talk to other people that know that field or have considered overshoot, they're like, yeah, right on board. Or even if they were just mildly exposed, it's like, oh, I've been waiting for someone who could express these ideas.
It finally makes sense. You put it together.
Yeah. Right. And I feel like that can happen in sort of the academic circles or the lecture circuit kind of thing. But to happen in politics requires kind of a mainstreaming of the extreme, right? And that's the part that's really tough.
And do we have time? That's what I think, like, do we have time for that process to play out? Given what we're facing.
Well, I don't know, but the thing to do if you're really struggling with this is go find some videos of dudes rolling their bikes off of cliffs with a triple Lindy backflip and then they land in a squirrel suit and catch a 1,000-pound fish. I mean,
let's put it all together.
I think AI is working on a video just like that right now for you, Rob.
That's our show. Thanks for listening. If you like what you heard and you want others to consider these issues, then please share Crazy Town with your friends. Hit that share button in your podcast app or just tell them face to face. Maybe you can start some much needed conversations and do some things together to get us out of Crazy Town. Thanks again for listening and sharing.
Red Bull presents Space Diver, a pay-per-view live streaming event this July 4th. The greatest daredevil of all time, Payne von Schmackenface, will perform the most extreme stunt ever attempted. He will exit the International Space Station with a precise leap to catch the Hubble Space Telescope. From Hubble, he will launch himself back to Earth at the perfect entry angle, steep enough not to bounce off the atmosphere, shallow enough not to burn up upon re-entry. At 100,000 feet, and while falling at over 800 miles per hour, he will intercept a motorcycle that has been released from a helium balloon, and he will ride this motorcycle onto the back of a 747 traveling at 650 miles per hour at 40,000 feet. He will then walk to the tip of the starboard wing as the plane descends to 29,000 feet, where he will shed his spacesuit and leap in his wingsuit towards his landing target, Caroline Island, a tiny atoll in the Pacific Ocean. He will then pull his parachute ripcord at 2,000 feet and aim for the Caroline Lagoon at the center of the atoll, where he will land on a jet ski. He will then speed the jet ski across the lagoon, reaching a velocity of 70 miles per hour at the point of a ramp that will launch him from the calm inner waters of the lagoon over the palm-lined sand of the beach and onto the fringing reef, where huge waves crossing the deep, shark-infested waters of the open ocean meet the island and break at stunning heights. The jet ski will jump the waves and enter deep water, where he will meet a party boat, and it will be required to freebase a dozen ghost peppers and use a bong to down a gallon of beer. Space diver Payne von Schmackenface and Red Bull, redefining extreme. Get your tickets now.
Crazy town, da 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 da, crazy town.